They've gone by many names: affinity, affection, social links, dating sim elements if you're a game reviewer. Whatever you call them, it's been popular in JRPGs for some time to include some mechanic where, through player decisions or gameplay, relationships between characters grow stronger, with impact on the story or granting bonuses to those characters. It's not something exclusive to JRPGs. Some Western developers like BioWare are known for their expansive relationship systems, but I'm going to be focusing on the way JRPGs in particular handle affinity. It's a mechanic that I personally usually enjoy. While it's not always done well, when it is, it adds an extra sense of connection between me and the characters, and I like seeing how different pairings impact the story. But, like many other things I enjoy, when involved in discussions about it, I find quite a few people don't like it, or at the very least, have certain problems with the way they are implemented, with some saying they won't play any games where affinity is a major gameplay element at all. So that got me thinking, as well as doing a little research on where affinity systems come from to begin with. I'd like to share my thoughts. Real quick, if you like this kind of content, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We're getting really close to the point where YouTube will consider us a real channel, which would be super exciting. Greatly appreciated. Before we get into my thoughts on the goods and the bads of affinity systems, I want to talk about why they became so popular in JRPGs to begin with. Dating sims have been popular in Japan since at least 1994, with the release of Tokimeki Memorial, which was not the first of its kind, but it was the first really big one. It's not entirely clear when they started taking hold of the JRPG genre. I'm sure in the comments someone will mention an earlier game that my research missed. Tactics Ogre in 1995 featured a loyalty system where decisions made by the player could affect a unit's hidden loyalty score. If it dropped too low, they might leave. Fire Emblem Genealogy of a Holy War in 1996 was the first one I could find where it was tied to romances, with a love system causing units to get married and have children who would become the characters in the next generation. Star Ocean, a few months later, was the first non-tactical RPG I could find with an affection mechanic, where the private actions you view have an effect on certain scenes in the ending. Another important one that year was Sakura Wars, the first game to be a true cross between RPG, visual novel, and dating sim, whose unexpected success led to an entire wave of imitators. There's a couple more games I think really helped spread affinity mechanics throughout the genre. While it wasn't a major part of the gameplay, Final Fantasy VII had an affection system where certain actions would affect who Cloud would go on a date with at the Gold Saucer. While it was a minor point to the game, Final Fantasy VII's massive success caused it to be the standard bearer for the genre. Skipping ahead nearly a decade, and you have Persona 3, whose social link system seemed to be responsible for a resurgence of the JRPG visual novel hybrids. It's likely an inspiration for very similar affinity systems in modern games such as Scarlet Nexus and the Trails of Cold Steel franchise. Now, let's talk about how affinity mechanics affect the gaming experience, and why some people enjoy it and others not so much. One of the most apparent forms this takes is in player-character romances. For some games, this takes the shape of a single romantic interest, where a certain amount of affinity needs to be earned in order to get a romantic scene. Others have the protagonist having multiple romantic options, and choosing between them based on who they raise their affinity with. Still others have multiple potential romantic pairings that require you to raise the affinities of each couple. That second category, which is closely tied to those games with visual novel elements, are often the first thing people think of when picturing affinity systems. This can be great for helping you deepen your connection with these characters and giving you a sense of investment in their relationships. When two characters get together, it feels like an accomplishment, something which you contributed to, as opposed to just the inevitable course of the story. It's also nice to have a choice in relationships, or whether there would be a relationship at all. How often have you played a game or watched a show where their main romantic interest is unlikable, and the romantic subplot actually harms the experience? There's no worry of that when you have the power of choice. Having different romantic routes to pursue also adds a layer of replayability to the game. On the other hand, it's been pointed out to me that optional romances don't typically have the same depth to them as romances woven organically into a story, and I can't say I disagree. Where the brewing romance is a major part of a story, there is time to slowly build chemistry between the characters that feels more natural and not as an aside. You can see the difference clearly in the Trails franchise. The Trails in the Sky games feature a story-driven romance that advances over the course of the game, which is paced well, elicits a lot of emotions, and is drawn to a satisfying conclusion, as long as you aren't too irked about the whole adoptive siblings bit. Compared to Trails of Cold Steel, in which our protagonist Reen has quite a large number of romantic options he can pursue, including his adoptive sister. What is it with Trails and adoptive siblings with romantic feelings? Because of the choices here, the romances can't be naturally advanced in the plot, and mostly are relegated to their own scenes. Another thing some people have an issue with is the age of the characters involved. JRPG protagonists tend to be young. When they're not literal high schoolers, they're often in their late teens or early 20s at most. It's one thing to be a passive observer of the romance between two young people, it's another to be an active participant. I've actually had two different conversations about the romances in Persona 5. One person argued that since Joker is a silent protagonist and meant to be a stand-in for the player, it is weird for me, as a grown man, to pursue a romance with any of the high school-aged characters. The other argued that since Joker is a high schooler, it would be wrong for me to have him pursue a relationship with any of the adult characters. Both of these people were completely serious. It just goes to show how different people can be made uncomfortable by these romance options. Personally, I don't really think about it too much. Whether it's JRPGs or anime, you kinda get used to protagonists who are younger than it makes sense for them to be. Not that I don't get weirded out when a romance option physically looks like a child, regardless of whether or not they're actually a 100-year-old dragon, but for characters who look and act like grown adults who for some reason are still in high school, it hardly registers for me. I can totally understand anyone who feels differently about it. It would be nice for us to get more JRPGs featuring older protagonists and romance options though. Moving on from romances, another way affinity systems are used is as a method of branching story paths or moments. Sometimes it's as inconsequential as changing a few lines of dialogue if the character likes you. Other times it can completely change an ending. A character that may betray you may remain loyal with a high enough affinity, or they might reveal something that the player would not have known otherwise. In some games, the true or best ending are even locked behind affinities. The great thing about these kind of mechanics is the extra replay value it brings. After seeing the consequences of your decisions and affinities the first time, it can be really interesting to go through the game again and trying something different and seeing how that changes things, or trying to figure out how to get the better endings. But the thing that makes this so great is also the drawback for some people. Not everyone has the time or desire to replay games, and many just want to get the best possible path and ending the first time around. I'll admit myself, as I've grown older and found myself with less free time, I'm more likely to do a quick Google search to see if there's anything I should be looking out for in an ending, instead of trying to figure it out for myself. Younger me love this kind of stuff though, and I still enjoy it quite a bit when the consequences are anything less than giving you the worst ending. Then you have the games where the affinity system is directly integrated into the combat, where you can literally defeat your foes using the power of friendship. Characters get bonuses when fighting near someone they have a high affinity with, or gain access to special abilities when they like the player character enough. These can be minor changes like gaining an extra crit chance, or to majorly game changing, such as unlocking better songs for your witches to sing when you shove your conductor's key into their chest. Man, Stellar Glow is a delightfully weird game. Like with most character progression systems, how much fun these can be is dependent on how well it's implemented. When it just feels like it's tagged on there so the developer can check a box, it's sorta lame. When it's used to give a game's combat more personality and feels like it's reflecting the character's increasing teamwork, it can be a really cool addition to the typical levels and equipment progression. Who doesn't like friendship attacks? Well, the big gripe people seem to have is that it adds one more thing for them to have to grind for in a genre which can already be pretty grindy. I do think there's a balancing act in these games to prevent you from having to run back and forth wasting potions on each other for friendship points just to have an edge in the next boss battle, but there are a few games I can think of where the affinity grind is particularly bad. I've been pretty broad when describing these affinity systems because I want them to apply to the breadth of games, and generally speaking, there hasn't been too much in terms of innovation in these mechanics, which is another point brought up against it. There are games that have experimented a bit with the formula. Xenoblade Chronicles, for example, expands the affinity system so instead of just being between your party or a select group of characters, there's a chart that includes every named NPC in the game and how they feel about each other, which is affected by which side quests you do. That's in addition to each party member's affinity with one another, because Xenoblade likes to torture completionists. And while I already mentioned one game in the series already, I feel like it's worth noting that Fire Emblem has several entries where you influence not just the protagonist's romance, but all the romantic pairings among your party, allowing you to play matchmaker if you're into that kind of thing. Those are my thoughts on affinity systems in JRPGs based on the major points of discussion I've seen regarding them. Overall, I quite enjoy them. I think I'm a bit more likely to enjoy a game that includes one in some form than one that doesn't, though it's far from a deal breaker for me, and I understand why some people feel differently. What do you think? Are you a fan of affinity systems? Are there any pros or cons to them that I missed in this video? What games do you think did it the best? Let me know in the comments. Hope to have more videos soon, including more game lists and skits, so be sure to subscribe to be notified. See you soon.